¿Ya conoces la última publicación del Centro Olof Palme México? Ven, vamos a conocerla.
¿Te gustaría saber cómo ha evolucionado el concepto de seguridad nacional e internacional en el presente siglo? ¿Deseas saber sobre la problemática de la seguridad ciudadana o hídrica? ¿Qué lugar ocupa el terrorismo en la agenda de seguridad nacional de México y por qué? ¿Qué relación existe entre género y seguridad? ¿Entre seguridad y cultura? Las respuestas a estas y otras preguntas se encuentran en el libro colectivo
La seguridad extraviada, apuntes sobre la seguridad nacional de México en el siglo XXI.
Coordinado por María Cristina Rosas y con las reflexiones de Guillermo Garduño, Luis Eduardo Pérez Ortiz Cancino, Gustavo Mauricio Bastien, Héctor Frías, Alfonso Aragón, Jorge Alfonso Monjaraf, Fernanda Padilla, José Jesús Borjón, Salvador Díaz Huitrón, Tomás Martínez, Severino Cartagena y Juan Pablo Prado. Adquiere ya La seguridad extraviada, apuntes sobre la seguridad nacional de México en el siglo XXI.
Envíanos un mensaje a través de nuestras redes sociales para adquirir esta y otras obras del Centro Olof Palme México. Contáctanos hoy mismo.
Good afternoon, Mexico, Washington. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to another session of our interviews called An Afternoon With. We are very happy to welcome today Dr. Daryl Kimball, who is Executive Director of the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C. I would like to encourage our audience here in Zoom and those of you who are following via Facebook Live to pose questions to our guests. I thank Daryl Kimball for being with us today and for his time. Welcome, Daryl.
Thank you.
I would like to introduce our guest briefly. As I mentioned, he is the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association since September 2001. And I should say that was a pivotal time, September 2001. Well, before that, he was the Executive Director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, a consortium of 17 of the largest US non-governmental organizations working together to strengthen national and international security by reducing the threats posed by nuclear weapons. While at the coalition, Daryl Kimball coordinated community-wide education, research, and lobbying campaigns for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, further depth and verifiable reductions in nuclear weapons stockpiles, and against the deployment of an unproven and ineffective national missile defense system. Prior to that, he worked as the Associate Director for Policy and later the Director of Security Programs for Physicians for Social Responsibility, where he organized media, lobbying, and public education campaigns against nuclear weapons production and testing, and research projects on the health and environmental impacts of the nuclear arms race. Daryl Kimball is a frequent source for reporters and has written and spoken extensively about nuclear arms control and non-proliferation and weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, National Journal recognized him as one of the 10 key individuals whose ideas will help shape the policy debate on the future of nuclear weapons. Daryl is a 1986 graduate of Miami University of Ohio, from which he received his BA in Political Science and Diplomacy Foreign Affairs, and a former Herbert R. Scoville Peace Fellow in 1989. So this is a short description of extensive curriculum of our guests. Before we move, Daryl, to the analysis of the arms race and nuclear weapons, I would like to ask you to describe briefly the activities that the Arms Control Association does, because, most of our audience is composed by Mexicans and Latin Americans, and I'm sure this would be of interest to them. Please.
Well, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you here for this conversation. Thank you for the invitation. And yes, the Arms Control Association is a non-governmental independent organization that has been in existence since 1971. Our mission is to provide information and ideas and solutions to address what we refer to as the security threats posed by the world's most dangerous weapons. And the primary focus is on the threat posed by nuclear weapons, but also chemical weapons, biological weapons, and certain kinds of conventional weapons that pose a particular threat and harm to civilians. Small arms and light weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, these are also issues we've dealt with through the years. And the organization, I think, is unique in the sense that we are not just a think tank. We don't simply do research and analysis, but we are a think and do tank. That is, we advocate for what we consider to be effective policies that reduce the risks of these dangerous weapons. And we mainly operate here in the United States, which is, of course, a major international player, but we also engage often and frequently with other governments, non-governmental organizations, and researchers from other nations, depending on the issue. We've had frequent and good relations and contact with the Mexican government and Mexican NGOs on several issues, most recently on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And right now we're very focused and concerned about the increasing tensions between the US and Russia, the United States and China, and the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament over the last few years, as well as the burgeoning global trade in conventional weapons to conflict zones across the world.
Yes, I like when you say that the Arms Control Association is a think and do tank. I like that because, many think tanks provide information and make studies and research, but I think the do part is very important. I would like to ask you, speaking about disarmament in general, what would you say is the profile that this issue is having in today's international agenda? I believe the profile of disarmament has been changing since the end of the Cold War. I believe in the 90s, it had a high profile. We witnessed international disarmament agreements as important as the Chemical Weapons Convention, and then the Landmines Convention, and later in this century, the Cluster Munition Convention, and of course, the Treaty to ban nuclear weapons, among others. But the profile has been changing. Many people suggest that disarmament is a topic of the past. What would you say about that?
Well, I think it is an urgent issue of the present, even though there hasn't been dramatic progress in the last few years in the international scene on nuclear disarmament in particular. There have been challenges and difficulties with other types of disarmament. There have been challenges to the taboo, the prohibition against chemical weapons use, of course, in Syria. But there has been, I think, a lack of sufficient implementation of the 2014 Arms Trade Treaty, which sought to establish a standard set of regulations and rules for the transfer of conventional weapons between and among countries. And a lot of that is due to the fact that progress in these areas depends on leadership from national governments. That depends very much on individual leaders in the United States, in Russia, in other major arms producing countries. It also depends on public attention and public pressure. And in that regard, I think there still is an enormous amount of concern about weapons-related security problems and dangers. Depending on where you live, there are different types of dangers to be concerned about. But when the media attention and the public policymaker attention is focused on domestic issues, on issues relating to climate change, the climate emergency, to governance issues. I mean, particularly here in the United States, we've had enormous debate about social issues. We've had enormous debate about President Trump and what we think of him, and that has taken attention away from a lot of the very serious, domestic and international weapons-related security issues that we have to deal with. And it's led, in the United States at least, to enormous divisions between our political parties about how to act. And that's led to a good deal of, let's just say, lack of action on the legislative and policy front. So I think there are a lot of reasons for this, but I think it's clear that particularly today's younger generations understand the world faces several sets of global challenges that affect all of us, that depend on action by all nations, the climate emergency, the disparity in wealth around the world that exacerbates problems of poverty and development, and also the challenges posed by not just nuclear weapons, which threaten everyone's existence if they're mishandled by the 9 nuclear weapons states, but also the ongoing threat posed by small arms and light weapons. And in countries like Mexico, in other areas around the world where the flow of small arms helps to fuel violence and conflict, and that is a problem that affects many, many people, even if the violence is inflicted on a small scale in large numbers.
Yes. I believe I have to agree with you when it comes to the fact that countries are different and they have different priorities, and these priorities change from time to time. So for instance, for Latin Americans, I believe the issue of small and light weapons and firearms, illicit traffic of firearms is of critical importance. And of course, I can understand that weapons of mass destruction is a very important issue for a number of developed countries, especially in Europe, especially when you think about Syria and the use of chemical weapons, or when you think about this crisis about the Ukraine and the tensions existing between Russia and the US. So yes, I believe it's different. It's difficult to say that there is one concern. I think that concerns vary depending on the circumstances. How bad is the environment, the international environment, when it comes to weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons? We know that last year, at last, and for the first time, the world was able to have coming into force the treaty banning nuclear weapons, which is a major achievement. Yet, nuclear powers didn't sign the agreement. So would you agree with the doomsday clock, for instance, stating that we are 100 seconds away from midnight? What's the situation currently about the threat posed by nuclear weapons in today's world?
Well, the threat posed by nuclear weapons has been with us for a long time. It has not gone away with the end of the first Cold War. The weapons that the United States, Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, and Israel have, did not go away in the 90s as tensions eased between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And we have not capitalized on the improvement in relations in the 90s to more significantly reduce the overall numbers of nuclear weapons, and also to engage the other nuclear armed countries other than the United States and Russia in the process. And so, we now see as China's economy and its role in the world has increased, we see growing tensions between China, its neighbors, China and the United States. Russia is President Putin not happy with the post-Cold War security environment and is trying to change the equation. And so we're on the cusp of what I would call a new nuclear arms race. Right now, it is a qualitative arms race in the sense that the US, Russia, China, and the other nuclear armed countries are developing new types of nuclear weapons. They're not increasing the numbers. And they also retain ambiguous policies about nuclear use. That is, most nuclear armed countries, except for India and China, which have no first use policies, reserve the right to possibly use nuclear weapons in response to non-nuclear threats. And because of all these factors, Mexico, Costa Rica, New Zealand, Ireland, Austria, a number of other leading non-nuclear weapon states pursued what we now call the humanitarian initiative to put an emphasis on the fact that countries that do not possess nuclear weapons see nuclear weapons differently. Unlike the nuclear armed states, they consider nuclear weapons to be unusable, to be immoral, and in fact illegal. And that is really the driving force behind the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was concluded, the negotiations in 2017. And it closes what many have called the legal gap in the global nuclear nonproliferation disarmament treaty architecture. And it very clearly prohibits the possession, development, testing, and use of nuclear weapons. And it's not surprising that the nuclear armed states have not been happy about this. The treaty challenges the idea that nuclear weapons are valuable for national security. And it challenges the notion that we can continue forward indefinitely in a world in which some nations threaten to possibly use nuclear weapons against one another. So I think the treaty is a very important historic step forward in solidifying the norm, the taboo against nuclear weapons in general. It reinforces the 1968 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which the 5 original nuclear weapon states are party to. It creates, I think, a pathway for future nuclear disarmament measures further down the road when the United States and Russia and China and others further reduce their arsenals and are getting closer to the point where they're prepared to think about total elimination. The TPNW provides a legal framework for how that can be achieved. And so this is a young treaty. It deserves, I think, more support. I would like to see my government recognize the TPNW rather than reject the TPNW, recognize it as a contribution towards disarmament, and to work with governments like Mexico on our common goal, at least on paper, of achieving a world without nuclear weapons, and our clear goal to prevent the potential use of nuclear weapons.
What could you say makes nuclear weapons some countries, of course, want to have? I remember a book by Ward Wilson, I'm sure you know it, 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. And I remember he spoke about the situation in France. He mentioned that without nuclear weapons, France would be a terrific place for wines and a terrific meal, but that's it. But nuclear weapons provides a certain sense of status in international relations. So I ask you this because we have North Korea and we have Iran also, and probably other countries interested in nuclear programs. So what would you say is so sexy to some countries to have nuclear weapons?
Well, that's a good question. But before I answer the question, let me answer another question, which is what is different about nuclear weapons? Why do we care so much? Okay, and I think it's important to underscore what is different about nuclear weapons. And you know, on a fundamental level, the use of nuclear weapons a third time, first and second being Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would be a world-changing event because of the destructive force of nuclear weapons. It is hard for a human mind to comprehend the destructive effects of the blast, the heat, the radiation. And what we know of is largely from the attack involving a single nuclear bomb on a single city, which was horrible enough. But the United States and Russia, as we sit here having this pleasant conversation, you know, could launch as many as 800 thermonuclear weapons each within 20 minutes of a launch order by either President Biden or President Putin. It would be suicidal. It would be catastrophic because the effect of the use of those weapons, or even a fraction of those 800 weapons, and there are many more in reserve, would destroy each nation. It would kill hundreds of millions of people, and it would have effects far beyond the borders of the two countries, of course. So these are weapons that, yes, you could say there's a low probability they will be used. They might be used, but if they are used, the world will not exist as we know it. Yes. So that is why they're different, and it's also perversely why they're attractive to some countries, because they are in the view of some countries, the ultimate way to threaten any country that might attack another country with retaliation. That's beyond comprehension. So for a country like North Korea, for instance, which has an authoritarian government that depends very much on the idea that the country and the government is under constant threat of attack from the United States, they justify the pursuit of nuclear weapons as a way of defending themselves against a US invasion and to protect the regime. I would say the approach of France, for instance, might be different here, okay? Because France in the post-World War II era was felt under threat from the Soviet Union. It was outside of NATO for a long time. It decided to develop an independent nuclear arsenal. And for France, a defeated nation in World War II, it was a way to maintain international credibility and a profile. It is a permanent member of the Security Council, not because of its wonderful wines or its great cheeses, but because of its nuclear weapons and its history. So, I mean, you're right. It does deliver a status, but that is not necessarily deserved. There are other countries that, for instance, should be on the Security Council of the United Nations because they are responsible, important actors on the world stage. You could argue that Brazil, the largest country in Latin America, might be a member of the Security Council, or South Africa, which had nuclear weapons and then decided to abandon them, deserves to be on the Security Council. But I think in each country that has nuclear weapons, there are slightly different reasons that have developed for maintaining them. There's a slightly different sense of their worth inside that country, and the task of encouraging these countries to abandon nuclear weapons and work towards their elimination. The strategy is going to be a little different in each country.
Yeah. You mentioned what distinguishes nuclear weapons from other weapons. And yes, the destruction, radiation, and all that can be terrible if countries decide to use them. which is why the humanitarian approach used by Mexico, Austria, and all these countries work very well. The humanitarian approach for disarmament issues has been working well also when it comes to landmines and cluster munitions and such. But speaking about nuclear weapons, I have this feeling that many people don't see nuclear weapons as dangerous as they are. And let me explain a little bit my idea. For example, in popular culture, you can see a lot of films and TV shows about meteorites or zombies or environmental catastrophes, but not much speaking about a nuclear war. I remember a couple of films, I'm sure you know them, The Day After, that's an American film released in the middle of the 80s, and another film made by the British, Threats. And I believe those are one of the few or two of few efforts to, through popular culture, empower the issue of what a nuclear war would be. But I don't believe people see this threat as a real threat. I'm interested in your views about this.
Well, you're onto something here because, I'm 57 years old. I graduated from high school in 1982. The threat of nuclear war was the preeminent international issue on the minds of everyone in 1982 because the Cold War arms race was at its height. President Ronald Reagan was joking in a radio interview about the bombing will begin in 5 minutes.
Yes.
The movie you referred to, The Day After, came out in 1983. And, because of the success of nuclear arms control and disarmament agreements that came about in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the threat posed by nuclear weapons faded into the background. And what happened in September of 2001, just a decade later, 9/11, and the threat, the specter of international terrorism became a dominant issue for many. There are other issues, of course, but my point here is that, this issue has been, for many people, out of sight, out of mind, out of the headlines.
Yes.
But the reality, and it's a dangerous reality, is that the weapons are still there. The policies that existed during the Cold War have, they've changed a little bit, but fundamentally they remain the same. The number of nuclear weapons is smaller, but the number we have today is still far larger than is necessary by clearly, and it's far more than it would take to destroy the United States and Russia and several other countries. So, this is the challenge of people working in my field, in your field, is to communicate to generation after generation the potential effect of nuclear weapons use and why we cannot become complacent and believe that simply because this is not in the headlines or it hasn't happened yet, it can't happen in the future. And that's kind of cold and chilling, but that's the reality. And that's a challenge for our work as campaigners and activists. And I think it's why the humanitarian initiative is so important, because what this did is this was an effort by many countries to highlight the many impacts of nuclear weapons over the years and what would happen if nuclear weapons were used again, and the reality that there is no defense against nuclear weapons use except prevention.
Yes, you're right. Not because it's not making headlines, it is not important. And the best example of this is the pandemic. Diseases were there, we didn't look at them, and now we have this situation. So we should pay attention. Yes, I agree. Now, I would like to ask you about the review conference of the MPT, because due to the pandemic, or or at least that has been the pretext. The review conference has been, canceled a number of times. It was supposed to happen this month, but again, it was postponed, probably for August, as I understand, as I have been told. But what do you expect about this review conference whenever it happens? I'm sure it will happen. But, the previous conference show a lot of disagreements. So what's your take on this?
Well, it's unfortunate that this meeting, which takes place every 5 years to review implementation of the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, has been delayed. It is because of the pandemic, the restrictions that exist at UN headquarters about the number of people who can be in a room at a given time. And I think it's unfortunate that it has been delayed, in part because of the things we were just discussing with the nuclear weapons threat. It's all the more important that there is higher level attention and international governmental focus on the challenges facing the international system with respect to nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons. And so, I mean, just to remind everybody that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is, the bargain struck in 1968 that says that all non-nuclear weapon states commit not to pursue nuclear weapons, that the nuclear armed states at the time in 1968, there were 5, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK commit to negotiations to end the arms race and to pursue nuclear disarmament, and that all states have the right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy for medical purposes and energy purposes, so long as they're not diverting it for weapons purposes. So, there has been, I think, a great deal of success with this treaty in terms of limiting the number of states with nuclear weapons. There have been some failures, of course. States outside the NPT, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea claims to have left the NPT, even though most countries don't recognize that. But the key issue at this conference, I think, is going to be, whether the nuclear armed states are meeting their obligations on nuclear disarmament, which is part of the treaty in Article 6. And the nuclear armed states are also arguing that past commitments made at past review conferences, and the last one where there was consensus agreement was in 2010, may no longer apply because events they've been overtaken by events. So there's going to be, I think, a tremendous debate at the review conference when it does happen about which of these previous commitments on nuclear disarmament still apply. What the United States and Russia in particular are planning to do to engage in negotiations to further reduce their still very, very large nuclear stockpiles. And it will be very hard to come together, all of these countries, there are nearly 190 states parties, on a consensus final conference document during a 5-week-long conference. And so, the Argentinian diplomat Gustavo Zlavinen is the president designate of the conference. He's got a tough job on his hands, just to organize the meeting and also to try to bring the states parties together as best he can to come to some agreement. I think leadership from the United States right now is even more critical. I hope that President Biden pays more attention to this issue. He has actually a great deal of experience on the subject of nuclear weapons. Yes. As many people know, he was a senator in the 1970s when he was in his 20s. It's amazing to think about it. And he spent a great deal of time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee working these issues. He gave a couple of speeches, in fact, at the annual meeting of my organization in 1979 and also in 2005 on the subject of nuclear weapons as a senator. So, a lot of us expect him to provide stronger leadership, but he needs a partner to make progress, and that's Vladimir Putin. And so one of the key things I think that will determine the success or failure of the NPT review conference in August is whether this month and next, the United States and Russia can get past this crisis over Ukraine and Russia's complaints about NATO's relationship with Ukraine. And then the other issue is the fate of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And as we speak, US and European, Russian, Chinese, and Iranian negotiators are trying to find a pathway to bring the United States and Iran back into compliance with this agreement, which in 2015 constrained Iran's capability to produce material for nuclear bombs. Yeah. It put stronger inspections in place, but President Donald Trump pulled out of the agreement in 2018, even though Iran was complying with the deal. And now they're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. They're trying to put the pieces back together again. So it's not clear whether they can or will. We should find out in a month or two. But these are the two issues I think that are going to make or break the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in just a few months.
Okay. Would you say that the treaty to ban nuclear weapons harms the NPT? Because that was an argument I found everywhere when the treaty was being negotiated. It's been said that the NPT has these three pillars that you already mentioned: disarmament of nuclear powers, and also non-proliferation of to other countries that don't have nuclear capabilities, and the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But it's been said that the treaty to ban nuclear weapons is not necessary. What would you say about that?
Well, I think, one could reasonably argue it's not necessary because we have provisions in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that call for action on disarmament. But I think we've seen that the NPT does not provide a sufficient lever, a sufficient leverage for non-nuclear weapon states to press the nuclear armed states to do so. But on the charge that has been made against the TPNW by the nuclear armed states that it's somehow incompatible with the NPT, it comes down to two or three arguments that I think upon closer examination just do not hold up. First of all, the argument that has been put forward about the TPNW, mainly by the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the Russians and the French primarily, is that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does not include standards for nuclear safeguards that are consistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, on that point, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, if you look at it, it does call for all states parties to uphold the highest possible safeguard standards. Now, there's a basic safeguard standard called Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then there's the higher level of voluntary safeguards called the Additional Protocol, which gives the agency greater inspection authority. Not every member of the NPT supports the Additional Protocol. And the TPNW does not lower the standard any more than the NPT does. And so I think the argument that it's inconsistent with the NPT is just, it doesn't hold up on that point. The other argument that was levied against the TPNW is that it does not provide for a clear mechanism for verifying the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, I think this is somewhat of a disingenuous argument because the TPNW is not a disarmament treaty. It is a prohibition treaty. It's by design, it was intended to establish a norm, a standard that says that states shall not, should not have nuclear weapons. It was negotiated by non-nuclear weapon states. I think it would have been a mistake if they were to have negotiated, and it's a very difficult topic, exactly how you verify the elimination of nuclear weapons. That is an issue that does require the involvement of nuclear armed states. And it is the responsibility of nuclear armed states, perhaps more than a Mexico or a Venezuela or a Kenya, to figure out how that should be done under international supervision. So the treaty does outline that there shall be a competent international authority who will be responsible at some point in the future for verifying the elimination of nuclear arsenals by any nuclear armed state that joins the treaty at a later point. So they have not decided how this should be done, nor have they ignored the fact that this needs to be done. They have simply not, the treaty negotiators decided for the nuclear weapon states how this shall be done. So I think the other point I would make is that the countries that were in the lead of the negotiation on the TPNW, and it involved a lot of states, but there was a core group of several states, including Mexico, Ireland, Austria, South Africa, Costa Rica. These are also among the leading supporters of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was Ireland, after all, that historians argue came up with the idea for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself. So it is, I think, preposterous to argue that the government of Ireland would take the lead in negotiating a treaty that is somehow incompatible with the NPT. So I think fundamentally the reason why the nuclear armed states are resistant to the TPNW is that it does challenge their notion that it is legal and it is okay and it is smart to continue to possess nuclear weapons. And so it's natural that these countries are going to object in any way they can. So in some ways, we should look at the criticism as a sign that the TPNW matters and that it challenges the nuclear weapons status quo in a good way.
Okay. Well, now we're having several questions for you. I will start by reading this. It says, does the new ASAT test by Russia, the ASAT tests that we've been seeing in this century, does the new ASAT test by Russia implies an escalation of new weapons even in space?
Yes, the anti-satellite test that was conducted a few weeks ago, it is another worrying sign that the competition between the major powers exists in many different environments. But the problem of the militarization of outer space is not a new one. I mean, this has been around for quite some time. In 1967, the United States and the Soviet Union took a good step forward. They concluded the treaty on outer space, the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits the emplacement of nuclear weapons in space. But it does not prohibit the deployment of kinetic lasers or kinetic weapons in space that can shoot down satellites, military or civilian, or hit objects on the ground from space, nor does it prohibit states from developing capabilities that can shoot down assets in space from the ground. And any country that has a sophisticated intermediate range ballistic missile can shoot down an orbiting satellite, which has a very predictable trajectory. So this is an area that deserves attention. It requires multilateral negotiations. One good development I can report is that the UN General Assembly approved a resolution introduced by the United Kingdom last fall that calls for an open-ended working group, which is UN speak for a group of experts to convene on a rolling basis to discuss space security issues and potential agreements that could address concerns of different countries. And Russia did not object to that. So we might see some productive discussions between the major spacefaring countries, the US, China, Russia, and China, and others beginning sometime this spring.
Yeah, let's hope so, because there's also the debris issue, all the debris caused by these tests that may harm the International Space Station or satellites. Yes. Okay, there's another question. After the withdrawal of the US and Russia of the ABM treaty, is it possible to see in the future a treaty of this sort?
In the near term, I would say no. And that is mainly due to domestic US politics. Missile defense has become a very controversial issue in the United States. And most politicians, including many Democrats, all Republicans, I think at this point resist any restrictions on US capabilities to shoot down ballistic missiles. Now, the current US policy is that our missile defenses are designed to deal with a small ballistic missile threat from a country like Iran, which doesn't have the capability yet, or North Korea, which is developing one, and not a country like China or Russia with a large force of nuclear armed ballistic missiles. But Russia's concern is that the United States ballistic missile interceptor capabilities could improve, or the interceptors could be positioned close to Russia. And so they want assurances that the US system will not expand to the point where it could shoot down large numbers of their nuclear armed offensive missiles. So this continues to be a problem. The US withdrawal from the ABM treaty, I think, was one of the biggest foreign policy mistakes. It's one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin is not a happy man right now, and is causing trouble in Eastern Europe. So it will take some creative diplomacy to get around this. I think what can be done by the US and Russia in the near future is for each country to outline in writing what their plans are with respect to missile defense for a period of, let's say, 5 to 10 years. So the United States puts down, these are our plans. Russia puts down its plans. Yeah. And at the very least, what this does is it gives the other side some confidence that, okay, this is what we can expect. And if one side or the other changes plans, decides to deploy more interceptors and more capable interceptors, they need to notify the other side, and the other side can then adjust accordingly. So that would provide some predictability, because currently a lot of Russia's resistance to nuclear arms reduction comes from their fear that the United States might increase our capabilities of missile defense, which, by the way, are not very good from a technical perspective. These interceptors do not work very reliably. So that's how I would describe the situation. So long story short, no, we will not see a new ABM treaty, but there are some solutions that might be able to help solve this impasse.
Yes. Okay. Now, let's move to the issue that has been widely commented here in Mexico, the distinction that the Mexican foreign minister got from ECA due to the efforts of the Mexican government in fighting the illicit traffic of firearms. Could you comment on this distinction, what it means, and why did you decide to support these efforts by the Mexican government and our foreign minister?
Yes, so we were very pleased that the awarding of what we call the Arms Control Person of the Year award went to Secretary Ebrard, and this effort to file suit against U.S. gun manufacturers for their role in the illicit gun trade that is so terribly affecting Mexican internal security. And what we've done every year since 2007, and this started out as a kind of a fun project that has taken on a life of its own, is we have been nominating a number of individuals and institutions that we, the staff and our board of directors, believe have contributed to arms control in the broadest sense of arms control. Sometimes these are individual efforts by, for instance, a labor union in South Africa that refused to unload weapons destined for a country in Africa that was subjected to an arms embargo. And so we nominated the labor union for unilaterally taking action in that regard. We've recognized members of Congress for passing important pieces of legislation on arms control, et cetera. So we nominate a set of individuals who've done something in the past year that we consider to be noteworthy and important and positive. And then we leave it up to the voters to decide in an online poll. And we encourage people to campaign for their favorite nominee. Okay. And so, this year, the Mexican government and foreign minister and the legal team that filed this suit got the largest number of votes. We actually had the largest number of votes in this year's contest than we've had in any previous contest. And that shows, I think, how much interest there is in Mexico for this initiative. So we hope that this raises attention and to this problem and to the effort by the Mexican government. And we hope it inspires your government to remain dedicated to pursuing this lawsuit and addressing this problem, which is a serious problem, even though it's not in the headlines here in the United States. Yes. It's in the headlines in a certain way in Mexico, but in a bad way.
Yeah. What do you think of this decision of Mexico to sue producers of firearms? Will it succeed?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, nor am I familiar with the details of the case. It is a novel approach. Yes. It tests some of the legal principles, as I understand it, that apply. The gun manufacturers are arguing that they don't intend for these weapons that they're selling to be used by criminal gangs or to be sold illegally across the border. But I think it's pretty clear in the filings from the government of Mexico that the gun manufacturers understand what is happening ultimately with these high-powered weapons in many cases, and they are actually marketing in ways that make it more attractive for buyers south of the border, let's say, to seek these weapons. So we will see what happens, and I hope that this gains greater attention. Even if the suit fails in court, I think it will have succeeded in putting a spotlight on weapons manufacturers and their executives, and reminding their shareholders and investors that they may be criminally liable for their actions, and they have to change their behavior. And I think it's also a reminder to the United States government that that it has to be much more vigilant in enforcing our own domestic laws with respect to the transfer of small arms and light weapons, and to enforcing the illegal trade. We pay a lot of attention here in the United States to unauthorized migration from the South into the United States. We don't pay nearly enough attention to the unauthorized and illegal transfer of dangerous weapons from the United States into Mexico and beyond to other countries in Central America.
Not fair, huh?
Not fair.
Not
Indeed.
fair. Yeah, I agree. There's another question. We are approaching to the end of this marvelous interview. The question says, it seems that the failure of the most recent review conference of the NPT has to do with a proposal to have the Middle East as an area free of weapons of mass destruction. What happened with this proposal? Will it also be an issue in the new forthcoming conference, the postponed conference of the review conference of the NPT?
Well, it very well could be a problem issue. This was the issue that wrecked consensus in 2015 at the 2015 review conference. So the concept of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East is an old one that goes back decades. It is a demand that comes from the Arab group of states that it first was really raised in 1995 at the NPT Review and Extension Conference. So this has become a de facto commitment by all state parties to pursue this objective. And the first step towards such a zone is to organize a series of diplomatic conferences involving all states in the region, including Israel, of course, which possesses nuclear weapons, even though it does not acknowledge it has nuclear weapons. That also involves, the involvement of countries like Syria, which still has some chemical weapons. It involves Egypt, which is not a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention. It involves Iran, of course, which has a uranium enrichment program. So, it requires involving all these states. And one of the problems has been that the Arab group led by Egypt has not agreed to modifying the agenda for this meeting to address Israel's needs and demands. And Israel has said that we want to discuss broader security issues in addition to WMD specific issues. So whether that's right or wrong, Israel has insisted upon that, and there's not been an agreement. So that is one of the reasons why a conference involving Israel, as well as the other countries, has never yet been held. But one of the solutions that came out of the 2015 failure was that the Arab group of states pursued a UN General Assembly resolution that called for the Secretary General of the UN to convene a conference. And that resolution passed, and the Secretary General convened a conference. It was a 2-day affair. The first one was in 2019. The second one just took place last November. It was, by all accounts, a productive meeting, but it was a meeting that did not include Israel. So how the states parties to the NPT are going to sort this out at the review conference is still to be determined, but it could be one of the holdups at the meeting. But I think it is a resolvable issue, and it's not quite as difficult as the other two issues I mentioned before, the impasse on disarmament, commitments on nuclear disarmament by the Nuclear Five, and what might happen if the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action talks end up in failure.
And probably the current negotiations with Iran play a role as well, right? Because I remember Israel was not very happy with the prior negotiations carried out during the Obama government with Iran, right? And that was one of the
Correct,
issues.
although remember, Iran is not going to be at this review conference. They will be there as an observer. They're not a member of the NPT. So they can't by themselves, wreck consensus unless, they also have the support of a country like the US. But, in the last year, I think the Israeli government has come to recognize that Prime Minister Netanyahu's adamant opposition to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal was a strategic mistake. And they are much more amenable to a restoration of mutual compliance by the US and Iran with the 2015 deal, although they're still very skeptical about the value of that agreement.
Yeah. Okay, let's wait and see. Well, we're approaching the end of the interview, and by looking at your curriculum, I remember it's been mentioned that you coordinated community-wide education and education for peace, I suppose. And this is an issue that concerns us all. In this respect, I would like to ask you about, in your view, how could we make education for peace a more relevant issue in today's world, in our universities, with our students, with our professors, and all the academic community?
Well, that's a good question. It's a big question. You might be more qualified to answer that than I am, because that's what you are engaged in professionally in university settings. But as I move through my career, and I've worked with a number of people in my organization, interns, I have over time recognize more and more the value of engaging young people in the work, not just the research work, but the advocacy work, and bringing them into the field. And there are different ways that people can contribute to peace and international security. It's very rare that someone like me has the opportunity to work professionally every day on these nuclear arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation issues, but every one of us can find ways to contribute, either as a university professor, an educator, a high school teacher, a community organizer. I think one of the most important things that we need to think about is how issues related to disarmament and peace relate to economic development, to gender equality, to improving our world by means of spending less money on weapons and more money on people. And so there are many different ways we need to think about the nuclear and chemical and conventional arms control issue than we often do. And I think it needs to be seen as a key part of a healthy society and economic development and a sustainable planet. So that would be my answer. But I think the work that people are doing to train the next generation of experts and activists is critical, because these issues and problems, unfortunately, are not going to be solved very soon. Hopefully, some of them in my lifetime. And it will be up to the next generation to come up with the ideas and solutions that address the issues that people of your generation and mine were not able to resolve.
Yes, it's true. Let's hope the next generations can do better in a way. Yeah, to end with this interview, I would like to ask you about an issue that's been comment for a while, and it's the advocacy of Mexico as a sponsor of disarmament. The foreign policy of Mexico has always pushed for disarmament issues. In your view, and this is the final question to say goodbye, would you say this advocacy of Mexico towards disarmament can create a confrontation with the US at some point?
Well, Mexico has long been a champion for disarmament. It was a champion for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in the 80s and 90s. It has pursued the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I think that the relationship between Mexico and the United States is very strong. It always will be very good. I think that countries that are friendly with one another understand that from time to time there will be differences, and there will be respect for those differences. So I think it would be a grave mistake if Mexico did self-editing or held back. It needs to be respectful in its pursuit of a world without nuclear weapons. It needs to recognize that the United States policies need to shift. And it has a unique role because it is a neighbor of the United States to work closely with Washington. It has ties to the United States that many other non-nuclear weapon states don't have. So I hope that Mexico continues to play a leadership role, an even stronger role in the years ahead.
Yes, we are very proud of our foreign policy when it comes to disarmament issues and all this and the achievements we've made. So let's hope we keep that way. So Daryl Kimball, thank you very much for your time and for these views on a set of very complex issues. I believe your views have been very useful for Mexican audiences and other people who has joined us this afternoon. Thank you. I hope we can continue this dialogue in the future because these issues are, going on and on, come and go, and there will be enough material to discuss in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.